there is Libya. I'm so glad we have this map. I can just point to it. You can get a geography lesson. In 1974, my father had an odd job. He used to, on behalf of the government of India, sell coal. And he had been to Lebanon and Turkey in the 50s selling coal. And he returned to North Africa to sell coal in these markets. So I went with him in 1974. In those days, to get from India to Libya, we had to fly from Bombay to Karachi because there were jet planes, but they went all the way to Rome or directly to London, not yet to London, but to Rome. So we'd fly and then eventually to Manama in Bahrain, which is right there, just basically a province of Saudi Arabia. And then from Manama, you'd fly to Cairo, and then we took an overnight train to the beautiful city of Alexandria, and then we took a car and drove to Tripoli. Now, you have to imagine driving from Alexandria, which is just about where the R from Israel is, just a direct line down. Along the coastline, you'd pass Tobruk. Now, here's the interesting thing. In 1974, which was 5 years after Gaddafi had seized power, Libya's main exports were not oil. They were two things at this point. Oil was beginning to develop because it had just come into its own. It may have been already one of the top two, but it was not yet a big deal. They used to export esparto grass, which is used to make paper, and they exported scrap metal. Now, the scrap metal was the detritus of World War II. Because as you drove across the border from El Alamein, a big battle in World War II, to Tobruk, I mean, these are all real places, but they're battlefields. You'd see German half-tracks buried in the sand, British tanks, and they would be stripping the metal and selling it in the international market. This was the big thing. But as you entered Libya, there were enormous pictures of Gaddafi. Because until about the late 1970s, for the first 10 years, Gaddafi was an extraordinarily popular man in Libya. In fact, the interesting thing about the overthrow of the king in Libya was that the king was greatly reviled and hated, and Gaddafi's coup took place without a shot being fired. This was the last major Nasserite coup in the region. If the Nasserite coups begin with Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1952, on the other side is the coup in Iraq, where Qasim overthrows the monarchy, and then in this end, in 1969, it's in Libya. Now, these are interesting coups because these were coups conducted by people who were not generals. These were colonels' coups. That's an important thing. Their support was in the rank and file of the armies, and they were very much closer in touch with society. So when Gaddafi conducts the coup in 1969, it was greatly popular. And in fact, in the early 70s, there were these giant pictures. He was a very attractive looking man. There were giant pictures. People adored him. That was 1974. Let's leave that aside. Let's come to the present. Libya now is a difficult place. It is broken into many pieces. I traveled to all kinds of places, but now I'm afraid to return to Libya. Getting into Tripoli airport is extraordinarily dangerous. The way to arrive in Tripoli now is to fly into Tunisia, into Tunis, and take an overnight bus to Tripoli. And along that road, you cross the border regions of Tunisia, where there are ISIS brigands who man checkpoints as you cross into Libya. That's Libya now. I'm going to talk a lot about Libya, so I want to give you a sense of these two eras. The one era of early Gaddafi and the era now of early regime change, and what this has meant for the people. So, traveling in Libya now is, as I said, a very surreal experience because there are checkpoints across the countryside. Now, Libya is an interesting country because it's, to my mind, it's largely an archipelago of cities and towns. That, you enter a town and then you can drive into the desert and you come to another town. The checkpoints are all over the place and everyday life is perilous. Remember, the NATO charge to enter Libya was that they were going to enter to protect civilians. The outcome has been exactly the opposite. So I'm going to talk about the procedure known as responsibility to protect that provided the rationale for the war against Libya. But all along, as I'm talking about some of these things, I want you to remember that there are people who live there. That what happens in our various approaches in international law and discussions of diplomacy, when we talk about the Syrian war, we keep forgetting that there are really people that live there. That they have lives, they have families, they are raising children, they are worried about education, they are worried about food, they are worried about their culture, they are worried about their religion, they are worried about their lives. And I don't want you to forget that, because too often in these discussions we make everything arid and abstract. And places become just zones. They become war zones, they become geopolitical zones of discussion. So keep this in mind. Something dramatically changed in the early 1990s when the United States started bombing Iraq in 1991, after Iraq had entered Kuwait. Inside Saddam's presidential palace, he had invited his closest advisors. And among his people who were there was his culture minister, Hamdan, who was a very erudite, well-read person. And in their discussions, which by the way, like Richard Nixon, Saddam taped everything. So you can listen to these tapes and listen to the conversation. In that conversation, at one point, Hamdan is discussing with Saddam, where are the Russians? What is going on here? We are being pummeled. Baghdad is being bombed. Nobody is trying to stop this. In fact, if Hamdan had been slightly more cognizant of recent history, he might have noticed what had happened in Panama in 1989, and there's a great documentary called The Panama Deception, where the United States came with incredible force to basically bomb Panama City, send in special forces, seize Manuel Noriega, bring him to the United States and throw him in a prison in Florida. It's an extraordinary event. Unheard of event, really, if you think about it. I mean, yes, there's been in the 20th century a history of coups, history of overthrow, but most of them were deceptive. They attempted to say, we didn't have anything to do with it. Even the coup in Iran in '53, only later is the role of Kermit Roosevelt revealed. American troops didn't come in there. Things were done in a kind of, as it were, cloak and dagger way. But in '89 in Panama, there was no debating what was happening. These are American planes bombing, American ships bombing. Fine, you could say, wait, under the Carter administration, the harbor in Managua was mined, to sort of suffocate the new regime in Nicaragua. But they didn't go in and bomb the country. They mined the harbor. That was an aggressive act. That was an act of war, but they didn't bomb the country. This was new. Massive bombardment of the country. Special forces comes in, seizes somebody and is off. Wow. We haven't seen anything like that. Hamdan hadn't looked at Panama, maybe not taken Panama seriously. After all, to some people, Panama might have appeared always as an American colony. After all, the canal is there. America has some sort of extraterritorial claim, perhaps, on Panama. They might do this in a small Central American country. I mean, Contras, all this stuff was going on. Again, duplicitous wars, the dirty wars. There was no real direct American intervention. This was direct. So he's sitting in the presidential palace saying, what's happening? Where are the Russians? That's the moment when a new phase opens, which is the phase of unipolarity. Then the United States basically understood that its constraints on its power had been removed. The Soviet Union had basically collapsed by then. Although effectively it's going to collapse later. But effectively it had already collapsed. In fact, by the late 1980s, its control over world affairs had deteriorated greatly. Some people say it had to do with Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. Also internally, economically, there were great troubles. And they were not able to handle their transition. They were gone. So Soviet bloc was not there to constrain American power. And the third world bloc, as it were, had collapsed also in the 1980s. It was unable to put any challenge forward against Western power. And you might think, that's a silly thing to say. When were they ever able to challenge Western power? Well, you need to go back and see the fights in the United Nations General Assembly. If they didn't have the power to constrain, they at least used the institutions available to them to cry themselves hoarse about, too much interventionism. I'm going to come back to the idea that suddenly, with responsibility to protect, Westphalian ideas of sovereignty have been deteriorated. But I just want to say one thing directly, that for the colonized world, there was never a Westphalian protection of sovereignty. I mean, from, 1648 till, R2P, which was passed in the UN in 2005, in the colonial world, there never was any integrity of sovereignty. I mean, you could come in anywhere. The French gunboat diplomacy, they want the Chinese to sell them tea. They basically throw opium at them. The Chinese say, we don't want it. They go to war against the Chinese. Where is the question of Westphalia during the opium wars in China? So let's not see, when we think about sovereignty and we discuss, Westphalia to responsibly protect, we forget that large parts of the world never enjoyed the privileges of Westphalia. That was a privilege that the Europeans accorded only to themselves, not to the rest of the world. At any rate, with the Iraq opening here in 1991, what we see is a new era open, this era of unipolarity where there is neither the Soviets nor the Third World Bloc, and this goes from Iraq out to Yugoslavia in 1999, where NATO war on Yugoslavia. And the term of art used here was humanitarian interventionism. This was the term of art. In this decade, this term was understood by most people around the world as a so-called Western concept. In other words, it was a Western attempt to militarize human rights, to conduct these wars, to clean up the so-called rogue states. These were the terms that the US State Department and its intellectuals were mobilizing. Rogue states, humanitarian intervention, etc. The term rogue states was a very interesting term, because you then make a list of people who were outside the pale of civilization, that you could use whatever means to get rid of them. And the list kept changing, but there were some actors who remained on it quite in a stable way. Iran, North Korea, Syria was on and off it, and then it remained on it, etc. These were the rogue states. Later, Venezuela will be seen as a rogue state. Not when the Christian Democrats are in power, or Action Democratic, those were not rogue. It was when Chavez comes to power, it becomes a rogue state. So, in the 90s, this concept of humanitarian interventionism was understood broadly to be a Western concept. And this is important for what comes next. It's a Western concept where human rights, the discourse of human rights, was being militarized. Now, in Darker Nations, I have a big section about how the concepts of human rights, the kind of contours of human rights, don't come to the United Nations from Western liberalism. They actually come to the United Nations from the anti-colonial movement. In fact, because many of the new states were not there at the table in San Francisco, it was a series of women from the Caribbean, from the Dominican Republic, etc., who sat there at the UN meetings in San Francisco and pushed hard for much more expansive ideas of human rights to enter the Charter. This is a history we've broadly forgotten, that these women from the Caribbean fought to put human rights front and center. There was no pressure coming from the Americans or the Soviets. Neither of them liked the concept of human rights. This was really an anti-colonial idea that comes on the table. But just put that on the side. But by the 1990s, the idea circulating in capitals around the world was that human rights was being militarized. In other words, it was interesting how certain people are beginning to define what constitutes a human rights violation and where. This was a very parochial exercise. So that, I'm going to come back to this later, at no point, for instance, was the human rights of the Palestinians sufficient to militarize the response against those who are violating their rights. Or at no point was there an interest in the people in East Timor whose human rights were being violated. In other words, Western allies, when they violate human rights, however egregiously, don't come on the table as rogue states. And here, again, if you are interested in the story of Rwanda and the Congo, this is a very telling way in which that history must be understood. That countries that routinely have major violations of human rights but are Western allies will never have the question of human rights militarized against them. by the way, Exhibit A, Saudi Arabia. Just on the table, just for discussion. Okay. So, in this era, Western interests were masquerading as universal interests. So, humanitarian interventionism appeared as a universal logic, when actually, even in world capitals, people said this is not a universal logic. In a way, the discourse of terrorism changes the shape of some of this argument. Especially after 9/11, there was now, because there was maybe global support for the United States at the time, there was a sensibility that interventionism was okay against terrorism. There were discussions now about anti-terrorist or counter-terrorist conventions where terrorist havens could be tackled even when they were outside in somebody else's sovereignty. So the discourse of the global war on terror opens the door for what had been, let's say, Western interests masquerading as universal interests, now becoming universal interests. But here again there is a great danger. So let's take 3 examples. The United States goes to war in Afghanistan after 9/11 on October 7th, 2001 in order to clear out terrorist havens in Afghanistan. That was the premise. Later, because this has become a habit and militarization of human rights is important, Laura Bush, First Lady, says it's about women's rights. It's an irony. Remember I said earlier in the 1970s there were all these women in position of authority, then you back this guy who hates women. Now you're saying we're going in to save the women. It's like a pinball machine, disorienting. You're being knocked here and there, you're not sure what to think. But they militarize human rights, in other words, you militarize women's rights here. To save women, we must go to war in Afghanistan. But the basic premise of it was that this is to knock out terrorist havens. Now, that's fine. Israel, you might remember, in 2002, decides to go and knock out terrorist havens in the West Bank, Gaza, etc., and starts major operations in the occupied territories. Now, I don't know if you remember a young American woman from Washington State, from Evergreen State College, Rachel Corrie. A bunch of these Americans go in the International Solidarity Movement, ISM, to stand in front of bulldozers. And she is, of course, killed. Tom Hunsdale, a young British ISM person, is shot and killed. So these people went there because of this immense usage by the Sharon government, Ariel Sharon's government, to use the discourse of counter-terrorism to clean up its problem. I mean, to define, in other words, Palestinian resistance as terrorism. So this was enabled, and again, backed by the West. The West, there was no complaint. An American citizen is killed, her parents barely received a letter from the government saying that, we're sorry that your daughter, a US national, was killed by a Caterpillar bulldozer made by a company in Illinois, perhaps paid by the, $3.1 billion disbursement per year that the Americans give to the Israeli government. So our taxpayers have killed your daughter. Sorry about that. There was no real acknowledgement. She was detritus. She had to be willed aside in this war against terrorism. So Israel used that. The Indian government was eager to also use this logic, especially after there was an attack on the Indian Parliament on the 7th of December 2001. What I'm trying to give you a picture of is that the logic of the global war on terror was appealing to lots of governments. They wanted to clean up their messes and disregard human rights. In fact, actually the opposite. Use the language of human rights to go and smash their enemies. Most effectively used in Sri Lanka by the government of Mahinda Rajapaksa to go and smash the Tamil Tigers, put people in concentration camps, etc. Very brutal end of that war. It was done in the name of human rights. It was done in the name of counter-terrorism. So the second phase after 9/11 is where militarization of human rights becomes a universal affair. Everybody's having a picnic here. They're all enjoying using this discourse to smash people. In this period, stunningly, the human rights community was quite asleep. I had a discussion once with people who worked at two of these groups in New York, and I asked them, why aren't you writing a report on militarization of human rights? Not on this issue, that is. Write a big report on the idea of using human rights for conducting wars. A critical report. There was no stomach for that. In fact, you can see the level at which these groups stoop. Human Rights Watch, Executive Director of the Americas Division, basically campaigned against the peace deal in Colombia. Basically, he campaigned against that deal. He wrote in the Miami Herald, he wrote in Colombian newspapers saying that you cannot have this deal because the FARC, the revolutionary armies of Colombia, cannot have impunity. They must face prosecution. What actually he's saying is the Sri Lankan solution. That the government of Colombia should go and use the discourse of human rights to crush them, kill thousands of people, rather than conduct a peace agreement and bring everybody to the table. By the way, just to put this in, again, another context, human rights organizations, Amnesty, HRW, nobody said at the time of the end of the apartheid regime in South Africa that there should be no impunity for the apartheid rulers. And they should be sent to prison and crushed. They said, no, peace and reconciliation, it's great. In other words, when the friends of the West lose, let's have peace and reconciliation. When the rogue elements lose, let's crush them brutally. Let's militarize human rights. Something to think about. You see, George Bush ruined everything for this dynamic. And I know this is an easy laugh, but I admire, unlike all of you, I admire George W. Bush. He's perhaps the most athletic world leader. How many world leaders would have dunked that shoe? Imagine. Twice. Most of us would get smacked. If somebody threw a shoe at me, I would be struck. He was so quick. There's something to be said for being a former alcoholic. Your reflexes come back 10 times as good as those who have never had a drink before. Incredible. George W. Bush, not him, but his government, his regime, to use a term of art, his regime decided to go to war against Iraq finally, fully. After all, the United States had been at war against Iraq since 1990. That war had never ended. I mean, the sanctions regime was war by another name. You may remember, if you go and check on YouTube, you can see Ambassador Madeleine Albright being interviewed by I've forgotten, 60 Minutes. And she's asked about a UN report where I think Dennis Halliday was then the coordinator of Oil for Food. And this report, very, very powerful report, suggested that 500,000 Iraqi children had died because of the sanctions. And she's asked about this report, and Madeleine Albright, Secretary Albright, says, with a straight face and without contradicting or challenging the basis of the report, she said it was a price worth paying. 500,000 Iraqi children dead, a price worth paying. She could have said the report is biased. She could have said, I don't agree with the findings. Instead, she said it's a price worth paying. It's an incredible moral statement coming from the US ambassador to the UN, which is a post at the time. Incredible moral statement to have made. So the war had been unending. It had never really ended and then started again. But at any rate, in 2003, he decided to knock out the government in Iraq. I don't have time to get into this, but the strategic stupidity of this baffles me. Like, what you do by knocking out the Taliban in Afghanistan and the Ba'ath in Iraq is you deliver Iran, for instance, a great gift. It's two neighboring enemies taken out by the Americans. In this book I wrote called The Death of a Nation, I said this American wars and Iranian victory. Because Iran now suddenly is able to breathe. It has a pro-Iranian government in Baghdad, it has its links to Syria, it has Hezbollah, it has this, it has that. And in Kabul, elements who had been in exile in Iran come to power, like Ismail Khan of Iraq comes to power in Kabul, very close to the Iranians. Incredibly bad decision, merely on regional strategic grounds. Forget the rest of it. But actually, let's talk about the rest of it. The United Nations Security Council refused to authorize that war, despite Colin Powell's scintillating PowerPoint presentation about mobile, chemical weapon units. I don't know if you remember those pictures of the trucks, like ice cream vans for chemical weapons. And all this was quite extraordinary because as a young person in LA, Los Angeles, in 1988, I remember standing outside, on a traffic thing with a sign up against the Anfal campaign. And there was a company in LA that had sold components for the mustard gas. So we went to picket it. There were about 6 Quakers, 2 Kurds, and 3 or 4 of us lefty lunatics standing there. Nobody cared about, the Anfal campaign or, Halabja. I mean, these words meant nothing to anybody. And by the way, at the time, Donald Rumsfeld was going, shaking hands with Saddam. Germans were providing equipment, Americans providing equipment, go and tear gas the Iranians, mustard gas the Iranians. To the credit of the Iranians, Ayatollah Khomeini at the time released a fatwa saying we will not respond with weapons of mass destruction. It's an interesting moment in Iranian-Iraqi relations, where the Iraqis were using mustard gas provided by the West, and the Iranians bizarrely said we won't retaliate in kind. So you should go back and read this fatwa, especially around the question of Iran's nuclear policy. It's interesting to revisit that. But at the time, the UN said no war in Iraq. Millions of people around the world protested, etc. UN said not happening under our mandate. We are not giving the authorization. At that time, Kofi Annan, a year later actually, he should have said it right then, called this an illegal war. Now what that war did was it delegitimized the universalizing of liberal humanitarianism. It made it illegitimate now to imagine that the West had universal interests. This was the death knell of liberal humanitarianism, and you can see this in the writings, the tortured writings of the former Canadian politician and Harvard professor Michael Ignatieff, who was deeply, frustrated that the Iraq war had somehow ruined his life's work, which is to militarize human rights and to take out rogue states. And this seemed a great disappointment to people like him particularly. He then goes and tries to run for office in Canada, and the Canadians decided a choice between Michael Ignatieff and Stephen Harper. They picked Stephen Harper. Honestly, it's like a choice this election. But sorry, I don't want to get into that. We have different opinions. Around this time, at the Brookings Institution, there was a South Sudanese intellectual by the name of Francis Deng. And many of you may have read his work. Interesting work. Now, I don't want to get into the story of South Sudan and their own history of wanting intervention, but Francis Deng wrote a book where he argued for the need for sovereignty not to be seen as an inviolable wall. That if a country does not protect its citizens, then the international community has an obligation to enter. And so he talked in his book about responsibilities, protection. He started using these words, Francis Deng. Gareth Evans, who then would lead this charge intellectually and institutionally through the UN, adopts this language. And they, with the blessing, bizarrely, of Kofi Annan, this is Kofi Annan, UN Secretary General, who had said that the war in Iraq is illegal and had criticized the use of human rights for war, now authorizes this responsibility and protection discourse inside the institutions of the UN, and they hold a big world summit where the UN says, fine, we accept that if a country is unable to protect its civilians, its sovereignty is not a barrier to intervention. That was the basis of responsibility to protect. Now, there are some immediate problems. Before I get to the problems with R2P, there are some immediate theoretical problems with the discussion in the first place. It assumes that the countries of the South anyway had full sovereignty. This is in a time, 20 years into IMF conditionalities, where most of these countries had surrendered their sovereignty to outside powers. Just take a silly example, Pakistan. Pakistan used to have quite a robust educational system. But after the 1970s, when IMF study teams used to show up, many of them, by the way, with Pakistani economists on board, they would come, and they did come, and they wrote their reports, staff reports saying, you have to cut back on health and on education funding. Privatize, in other words. So what happens is, major funding enters from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc. to theologize education. This has an enormous impact on Pakistani society. So now how can you say that Pakistan is a sovereign country? Because its sovereignty has already been, circumscribed by these IMF conditionalities, etc., etc., etc. So the premise of the discussion was itself poor, and sadly, in the debates, nobody raised this point. That let's look at the question of Westphalia, which I mentioned earlier, and colonialism. Let's look at the question of economic policy, which has already been, eroded in our countries, and we don't have control over what's happening inside the country. So how can you now tell a government, protect your civil? We cannot protect our people. We can't feed them, we can't educate them, we can't do anything. We don't have the resources. You have us on a leash, tight leash. So our ability to protect is already cut back. These are theoretical problems with the debate. But then there are practical problems that emerged in R2P itself. You see, the responsibility to protect was going to come under what is known as Chapter 7 of the UN mandate, which would allow use of force. Ultimately, there were different procedures, diplomatic pressure, etc., sanctions, but ultimately it would allow use of force. So if a country is unable to protect its civilians, its sovereignty is not a barrier for use of force to come in and protect civilians. That's what Chapter 7 of the UN mandate will allow. So very, very dangerous mandate to allow countries to use force against other countries legally. Now, why did I say they're practical problems? Here are at least 4 of them. First practical problem, and you can take notes if you'd like, because this is mind-blowing stuff. Most people are not interested in responsibility to protect. I get it, it's boring, but Libya was destroyed based on this doctrine. So for the sake of pay attention to this bit. The first problem is, who decides when the civilians are in threat? Keep this in mind. Who makes the decision? So, the parallel will always be, for me, Palestine. When does the international community say, enough people are being killed, now we need a no-fly zone? Gaza, 2014, no-fly zone. Who called for a no-fly zone under R2P? Nobody. There was no pin-drop silence at the horseshoe table in Washington, in New York City, at the UN. Nobody said no-fly zone, nobody said sanctions, nobody said anything. In fact, quite the contrary, the United States resupplied Israel 2 or 3 times during the Gaza conflict of 2015. What conflict? The bombing of Gaza in 2014. So who decides when civilians are under threat? One. Secondly, what is your evidence that civilians are being killed or in threat? This is not an idle question. We'll come to this with Libya and you'll see what I mean. Number 3, what is a proportionate response to what is happening on the ground? What is a proportionate response under the R2P mandate? Do you go to regime change? What is the proportionate response? And number 4, after you've followed through an R2P mandated intervention, there should be a after intervention investigation. This 4th one is very important. Why? Because you want to make sure you haven't violated the terms of the mandate. Keep this in mind. These are 4 practical problems for an R2P mandate. Let's go to Libya. Number 1, who decides? I was stunned interviewing ambassadors who were at the horseshoe table in March 2011, how little they knew about Libya. They had no clue. And because the Libyan ambassador to the UN had defected to the rebel group, there was no Libyan ambassador to explain anything. That means Libya's seat at the UN was empty. This is important to think about. Who decides? Ban Ki-moon, UN Secretary General, in a press conference, was asked, how do you know that there are atrocities happening in Libya? Fine, people are being killed, but how do you know? And he said, we have been reading press reports. It's very interesting. We have been reading press reports. Okay. In my book, I write about the U.S. State Department. The U.S. State Department said, this is Derek Chollet, who was in the National Security Council during the Libya time. Derek Chollet said, we, the US, did not have a particularly good handle on what was going on inside Libya. That's a stunning statement from somebody in the National Security Council. We did not have a particularly good handle on what was going on inside Syria. David Kirkpatrick of the New York Times at this time wrote, the rebels feel no loyalty to the truth in shaping their propaganda, claiming non-existent battlefield victories, asserting they were still fighting in a city, etc. This was in the New York Times before the vote for UN Resolution 1973. So the State Department says, we don't know what's going on there, and yet they are convinced it's genocide. What were they listening to? Well, the main news outlet that said that 10,000 people had already been killed in a matter of 10 days was Al Arabiya, which is the state outlet of Saudi Arabia. Now, I asked two of the important ambassadors who voted, one abstained and one voted yes. Why did you take one news outlet seriously? And that to a news outlet whose government had a vested interest in the overthrow of this person. And they said simply, there was no other information coming to us. I was actually quite horrified, to be honest with you. I've been around in this business a long time. I've talked to lots of people who have mendacious things to say. I was quite horrified by the innocent naivete that they proposed to reporters. Whether inside their heads they had other thoughts, I don't know. I'm just saying, their statements seemed innocently naive. But, that's all we could see. So, who decides is number one. And who decides, obviously here, was the French, the Americans, and Saudis and Qataris. Now, Saudis and Qataris said that they had the Arab League backing. Again, the media, which is to explain things to people, neglected to say that half of the Arab League members didn't come to the meeting. So, Algeria, Libya of course didn't, Syria had been thrown out of the Arab League, Iraq didn't come. These are the main countries that would have opposed. They didn't come. It was basically the GCC countries, the Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Morocco. You get the picture, these are all monarchies. And I have a whole theory in here about the fight between monarchies and republicans in the region, but I don't want to get into that. So the Arab League claim that they also wanted to go in and protect civilians seems to be somewhat spurious. It's not clear when you say Arab League who you mean, because Arab League is an organization split into two parts. One part votes for something, one part votes for something. Gaddafi, 2 years before his overthrow, had the indecency to come to a Arab League meeting, which was held in Qatar, where he, in his typically flamboyantly indecent way, turned to the King of Saudi Arabia and said, "You are a creation of the British." And then he turns to the Emir of Qatar, his host, and says, "And you are a dog of the Americans." So in international affairs, don't underestimate the important power of personal hatred, particularly when you're dealing with monarchs, because they have sort of absolute power. So the great hatred of Gaddafi in these capitals should not be underestimated. You'd think that sophisticated ambassadors and their departments of defense would be factoring this into their calculations. And if Arabia is saying they're killing people, we've got to go and overthrow Gaddafi, you'd think, wait a minute, they hate Gaddafi. May not have to like Gaddafi. This is not a question of hate and like Gaddafi. They hate Gaddafi, they want to overthrow him. Is this the best policy? Remember, I'm not interested in whether you like or don't like. What's the best policy? So one, who decides? Who decides was the West, Saudis, etc. Secondly, what evidence? We've already gone into that a little bit. Press reports, Al Arabiya, etc. Now the third part is interesting. Proportional response. So immediately that call was made R2P must be to protect civilians in Benghazi because Gaddafi's forces were moving on them. And actually Gaddafi's forces were not making enormous gains, but they were certainly moving. And Gaddafi and his son did themselves no favor by coming on TV and saying, we will crush you all. By the way, if anybody understands the discourse of leadership in this tradition of republicanism, that's how people talk. You know, we're going to crush you all like cockroaches. We're going to take care of you. We're going to destroy all of you. We're going to raise your houses. You should listen to Sisi talking about the Islamists in Egypt. You should listen to Sisi's speeches. We're going to destroy your life. It's the same language. But this, of course, comes in the New York Times. He said he's going to crush them. Well, that's exactly the rhetorical gestures that these folks make when they talk. When leaders like Gaddafi, that's how they speak. So when the West decides protecting civilians is best done by regime change, and the fierce bombing begins of Tripoli, Amr Moussa, head of the Arab League, rushes to call a press conference in Cairo and says that we didn't want to back this. We just wanted protection of civilians. This is not what we wanted. Ban Ki-moon immediately grabs a hold of him. They have a joint press conference. And Amr Moussa says, actually, no, we are on board. We are on board. Who decides what evidence, proportionate response? Not clear that regime change is exactly what R2P was designed to do, but it has become that. Now, investigation after the fact. Government is overthrown. UN resolution 1973 backs it. French and Americans provide most of the firepower. Qataris provide some bombing. Saudis provide some assistance. And there are these rebel groups. In the questions, you can ask me about the rebel groups. NATO is asked, because it was done by NATO formally, to allow for an investigation. And I want to read you what the NATO legal advisor, Peter Olson, said about this request for an investigation. He said, we would be concerned if NATO incidents, he puts it in quotes, were included in the Commission's report as on par with those which the Commission may ultimately conclude did violate or constitute crimes. We note in this regard that the Commission's mandate is to discuss the facts and circumstances of violations of law and crimes perpetuated. We would accordingly request that in the event the Commission elects to include a discussion of NATO actions in Libya, its report clearly state that NATO did not deliberately target civilians and did not commit war crimes in Libya. So after action analysis is allowed, but you have to give us before that a statement that we didn't do anything wrong. So what kind of investigation will this be? NATO eventually didn't turn over targeting information, didn't turn over anything, and the UN investigation, if you can read it, if you can tolerate it, these are things I spend my time reading, is dull as dishwater. Because it's basically them trying to write a report with no evidence. And they look at two specific, Human Rights Watch, there was a good report they did, looked at two specific bombing incidents and said civilians were killed. And they asked, why was these areas targeted? In other words, they would have needed targeting information and cooperation of NATO. So NATO refused to cooperate with a UN and with a human rights investigation to basically verify if the mandate was upheld. Now, I'm going to end by reading for you a section from this book which opens up what are the alternatives. I'll be done in about 5 minutes. Was there an alternative to the regime change strategy that has destroyed countries and created chaos? It is important to remember that the African Union had wanted to insert itself in the early months of 2011 to mediate inside the complexity of the Libyan civil war, before the French bombers began to destroy the state. The African Union was set aside. When Saddam Hussein was arrested in Tikrit, he said, I am Saddam Hussein, president of Iraq, and I want to negotiate. The US troops humiliated him and threw him in prison, where he underwent a farcical trial and was executed. No doubt, Saddam was responsible for all manner of atrocities, most notably the use of Western-supplied chemical weapons against the Kurdish people of Halabja in 1988. But that moment was essential for Iraq. I want to negotiate. Negotiations are the antidote to regime change. Saddam Hussein might have been able to bring his Fedayeen Saddam to the table, asking for a truce and a new dispensation to save Iraq from destruction. Was he a credible force? Not for all of Iraq, but certainly for parts of it. In 2011, a NATO missile hit Gaddafi's convoy as it left Sirte. The Misrata militia seized Gaddafi, humiliated him as well, and then lynched him. He too should have been allowed to surrender and then to bring his political bloc to the table. In fact, in the early days of the Libyan revolt, Gaddafi sent emissaries such as the retired US Rear Admiral Charles Kubik and General Wesley Clark to say that he wanted a deal. The African Union's delegation sat in an aircraft ready to broker a deal. It was sidelined. Brazil's president at the time, Lula da Silva, offered to go to Libya and mediate a deal backed by the African Union, Latin American states, and even the Arab League. But the West seemed to want a war. In both cases, the West and its allies prosecuted what appeared for them to be a complete victory, which ends in complete disaster if other political blocs remain intact. There was no appetite for negotiations in Iraq, in Libya, or in Syria. It seemed acceptable to allow the old guard to return in Egypt and even in Tunisia. These countries had been made pliable by other means. It seemed even more acceptable to allow the monarchies complete freedom to crack down on their regimes. But the old Arab nationalists in Iraq, Libya, and Syria could have no quarter. Despite their own drift from their earlier commitments, these political forces had to be fully destroyed. The lessons of Iraq were not learned. They were repeated in Libya, and they fly like a famished vulture over Syria. These countries hang by a thread. Their people suffer painfully. They have been sacrificed to a theory that is arrogant and erroneous. It is a liberal religion that seeks to save the lower orders and make them darker reflections of a Western fantasy that no longer exists even in the West. That theory, regime change, deserves a place in the dustbin of history. Thanks a lot. Good question. What about Yemen? The war that began in March of 2015 and has been ongoing in Yemen has been prosecuted without an argument. What is the argument for the prosecution of the war against Yemen? Is it Iranian infiltration? Perhaps. Is it that the so-called legitimate government of Mansour Hadi should be returned? Perhaps. What is the war aim? In effect, the Saudis are never going to be able to extricate themselves from this war because there's no clear war aim. There is no liberal humanitarianism. They didn't go to protect civilians. You understand? There seems to me to have been a rush into this war for reasons that are actually quite good for Saudi self-interest, but have nothing to do with either protecting civilians or even keeping Iranian influence away. You see, the end of my book is about Yemen. And the reason I end with Yemen is Yemen and Palestine. Actually, the last chapter is on Yemen and Palestine. Because these are two countries that are basically, have never been allowed to breathe. Yemen has been, not only Yemen, but also Oman. Remember, there was a major Dhofari movement in Dhofar in the 1970s to create a kind of socialist Dhofar. And Yemen also had this left-wing government, a Marxist government in South Yemen. So this region of the peninsula has had this old left heritage. And the allowance to battle against it has been quite cheaply won. In Yemen, when the unity government happened in 1990, when Abdullah Saleh becomes the president of all of Yemen, he becomes a major ally of everybody. He's the most wily politician under the sun. He was an ally of everybody. But there's an incoherence in Yemeni politics. There is a problem of how to deal with the fact that there are sections of the population that feel out of play. You know, Saleh prosecuted a war against the Zaydis, you know, like the Houthis. Now he's an ally of the Houthis. I mean, that prosecution of that war, it had questionable results for himself. And there is, of course, from the Saudi point of view, because Saudi foreign policy is a sectarian foreign policy, sees the emergence of these Zaydis to authority as a threat. It's right on their border. And so there are all kinds of complicated internal politics of the southern part of the peninsula involved there. But at no point was the discourse of intervention to protect civilians or any of this mobilized. It's interesting that the Saudis have never bothered to seek any sanctification of their war. They just continue. British are selling arms, Americans are selling them arms, people are saying cluster bombs are being used, civilians are being killed. Have you at any point heard anybody say the king of Saudi Arabia must go because he has no legitimacy, he's bombing, you know, like quickly Assad must go, Gaddafi must go. So that language will never, it's unintelligible because they are allowed to act that way. So there's no need to justify what you're doing. War on poverty, war on drugs. Why do we think of everything as a war? You know, I mean, why can't we think of policies to tackle poverty or policies to tackle drugs? You know, wars on drugs end up with Plan Colombia, you know, which actually is a war that has been fought for 100 years to prevent decolonization. I mean, what Colombia is facing is a long-term decolonization process. And this is being blocked, most recently through Plan Colombia. Massive government subventions to the Colombian military to fight against what? Against, you know, FARC, who are suddenly narco-traffickers. You can call them narco-traffickers, then the war on drugs comes into play. If you call them terrorists, then the war on terror comes into play. Lots of people are making money on these interesting concepts, war on terror, war on drugs. At the time, people criticized this, saying that the war is problematic because it's without time and without space. In fact, the authorization given to the Bush administration by Congress is spaceless and timeless. So that you can then, from Djibouti, drone Yemen. And you can drone X and kill Y. And look at Afghanistan as an example. The previous Taliban leader, Mullah Mansour, was droned in Balochistan. The Pakistanis had in 2010 agreed that the US could drone in the tribal areas of the north, but they couldn't drone in Balochistan. But they drone killed the Afghan leader in Balochistan. He had returned from near Iran. What happened to the Taliban? They elected a new leader. They are in fact stronger now than they were then. So this idea of a spaceless, timeless war is a very dangerous idea because what's the strategy? I mean, this is a democracy. Wars are should be prosecuted in a democratic fashion. The government should come to the people and say, this is the war we are going to fight, this is what the war aims are, this is what victory is going to look like. But at no point has the United States government come to its people, this is what victory is going to look like. Because there's no victory against terrorism. If you drone kill somebody, then that person's relative is now going to become a terrorist. So this war is endless. It's Orwellian in its description. What people in the United States should call for is a public discussion of the war aims. Are the war aims specific? In other words, do you want to crush Al-Qaeda? That's a specific war aim. Or do you want to just, you know, be like a dragon, whipping its tail across this region, setting fire to people's homes? Is that the war aim? If that's the war aim, it's madness, dangerous. You're right. I mean, that's the price of living in a world where one power is so dominant, or a group of powers, the West, let's say broadly. People say, you're not doing anything, we're dying. People say, why are you doing this, we're dying. Okay? You get blamed either way. It's like being the boss. You're always in trouble. But that's part of the problem, isn't it? That we haven't allowed for a more complicated international architecture to develop. You know, we have the institutional framework for this architecture to come up. You know, why not allow regional blocs to become robust? You know, why should the United States be a member of, say, all regional blocs? Or have influence? Why not let them develop their regionalism with some integrity. I'll give you a quick example with Afghanistan. After 9/11, the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, the SCO, which had been created in the 90s, Chinese, Central Asian countries, they were all concerned about the Taliban. That was one of the things that brought them together. And because they all felt the Taliban was destabilizing the area. Uzbekistan had the greatest worry, much greater than anybody. Because in Uzbekistan, there was a movement called the Uzbek Islamic Movement, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan. And that group had severely destabilized parts of southern Uzbekistan. And they had going back and forth between Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. The Chinese were worried about influence of the Taliban in Xinjiang province. So they had created this regional forum to try to deal with the problem of the Taliban. After 9/11, the SCO reached out to the United States, saying, we would like to play a role here. We have links with people in Afghanistan. There is a way to do this homeopathically. We don't have to have allopathic attack on Afghanistan. So at the time, they were set aside. In the same way with Libya, the African Union was ready. I mean, Libya is a country in Africa. Fine, Gaddafi had played a big role funding the African Union, and maybe he was too influential in the AU. But they had influence and credibility with Tripoli. They might have been able to cool things down. So the antidote to this question of when the US attacks, we say why, when they don't, we say, is to fight to create an architecture of multipolarity, of regionalism, where regions begin to have responsibility and a role in peace and sustainability in their region. And I think this is a productive way. In South America, and for a moment, the creation of ALBA and these formations were important. But then, of course, because they relied so much on commodity prices, export of commodities, when the prices declined, they went into crisis and the bottom fell out from under them. But that history is an important history of regionalism. So I think it's not a question of should the Americans or shouldn't they. The question should be something else, is that we need to, as intellectuals, think about the importance of regionalism. Why should the United States be out there? Look at the interaction now between the government of the Philippines, government of Turkey vis-a-vis the US. These are two staunch American allies at two ends of Eurasia. And both of their leaders are talking really quite violently about the Americans. Duarte today again said, Obama can go to hell. He's like a boxer. He doesn't care. He said, okay, they killed 3,000 people in their war on drugs. So what I'm saying is that everybody feels hemmed in by the Americans. And I think it's about time for people to take charge of their own regions. That's the first one. Second one, look, sanctions, fine, it has big problems. Let's leave that aside. You gave two examples, North Korea and Myanmar. I bet Gaddafi, wherever he's sitting now, is regretting that Libya gave up its nuclear program. Two ways to not be overthrown by regime change. One is to allow the Russians to enter, and the other is to have a nuclear bomb. There's no way to be overthrown easily. Look, even India had to manufacture surgical strikes. Because both India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons. I don't even think, now the UN is saying, we have no evidence that India actually struck inside Pakistan. It's a humiliation for the government. It might have been fabricated. See, what I'm saying is that these are protections. And look, hypocrisy is miles deep. There were sanctions against Myanmar, Burma, fine. Then sanctions are slowly getting lifted. Now, Aung San Suu Kyi's government is persecuting Rohingyas. Right? The Rohingya people, Arakan region people. I don't see any conversation about R2P. Aung San Suu Kyi is like Mother Teresa. Everybody's like, wow, Aung San Suu Kyi. She's said quite openly, I'm not sure if they are Burmese. Okay, sounds to me like, any kind of authoritarian mindset. These are people who live in your country. You're saying maybe they should cross the border, go to Bangladesh, where they belong. Bangladeshis, by the way, are not helping. They also say, go back to Burma. Where's the planes flying above the Rohingyas to protect them? So, what I would say to that is, sanctions is used against people who are seen as enemies. They're not used against people seen as friends. In the 1910s, there was an immense feeling, from the late 19th century actually, in the Nahda period, etc., immense feeling of the emergence of the Arab peoples. That was there. And interestingly, it was mainly Christian intellectuals in Beirut who were writing about this great, emergence of the Arabs on the world stage. And Sykes-Picot, for sure, comes in as a colonial response to this, not as to this, but of course they had opportunity. The Ottoman Empire, and then these two powers want to divide the region. But they divided the region to divide this feeling. I mean, they could have said, the Ottoman Empire is gone, and you rose up. Remember, if you've seen your Lawrence of Arabia with Peter O'Toole, they betrayed the Arabs of Arabia because they wanted freedom, and then suddenly they were back in holding the reins, of holding somebody's horse along, and there's a white guy sitting on the horse. They said, we didn't want you, we overthrew the Turk, to us ride the pony, but now you are. So, that sense of not appreciating this upsurge of pan-Arab sentiment, which overthrew the Ottoman, which contributed greatly to not only World War I, but this sentiment contributed, that could have created a new geography. But it didn't. You instead had this, as you said, this divided geography. But then you get from Egypt, Iraq, etc., even in Syria to some extent, you get the rise of these Arab nationalist figures. And they also tried to reconfigure geography, because after all, what's the United Arab Republic other than to return to the pre-Sykes-Picot geography and say, although Egypt was not part of Sykes-Picot, but to return to that idea of pan-Arabism and create a new geography. And that, of course, fails because these countries have internal contradictions. I mean, pan-anythingism is never easy. Look at Europe. How easy has that been? Look at South Asia. Why isn't there a South Asian Confederation? By the way, perhaps the only solution to the occupation of Kashmir is to have some kind of South Asian Confederation where the national borders mean less and people can move around freely and whatever. So, it's not been an easy exercise, but I would say that less Sykes-Picot, what really weakened these projects was the economic collapse of the 1980s. And you see, Egypt was in the lead here. Because Egypt's open door policy starts in 1971. And then they all follow. And Libya, I wrote a book about this because I wanted to explain to people that neither is Gaddafi evil nor good. He's just a human being whose country has had a trajectory. So from 1969 to the 1980s, the transfer payments created a great deal of social wealth in Libya, including education institutions. By the way, they moved the law school, this is the law school, from Tripoli to Benghazi. And why is this important? Some of the early protesters were lawyers who had been trained in that law school, who had, by the way, 10 years before that, because this was the anniversary, not 10 years, 6 years before that, this was the anniversary of the shooting in the prison outside Tripoli, where the members of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group were killed inside the prison. These lawyers had represented their families of the victims. And the first protest in February of 2011 was around the anniversary of the killing of those people in prison, led by the lawyers. So Libya in the first 10 years, they produced institutions. Then when structural adjustment strikes the third world, it strikes Libya as well. And Libya goes into a confounding economic crisis when the son of Gaddafi, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, is tasked, thanks to his, I think, SOAS degree. He studied with, what's his name? Huh? LSE. He studied with, what's his name? The globalization theorist? David Helm. So Saif al-Islam returns to help his father, And he brings the diasporic Libyans back, including Shukri Ghanem and Mahmoud Jibril, and they come in to essentially create what they call openly a Gulf. Kuwait was the word they used. They said Kuwait on the Mediterranean. By the way, I wouldn't have picked Kuwait. I would have picked maybe UAE, Dubai on the Mediterranean. So what I'm saying is that geography of weakness was not necessarily, you don't need to go to Sykes-Picot, it may be more. I start my chapter on Syria with a poem from a Syrian poet, and I like this phrase, it's Nazir Kibani, I don't know if you know Kibani. Our enemies did not cross our borders, they crept through our weakness like ants. You see, I didn't get into this, but one of the great tragedies of, let's call it, the misuse of R2P in Libya. Let's call it that for the sake of it. One of the great tragedies of that is that if you talk to the Russians and Chinese, and by the way, Indians, for the Indian ambassador, who was one of my great, people that I discussed this with right through 2011, has written a book, came out recently called Perilous Interventions, which is a critique of R2P through the Libyan experience. A very good book. His name is Hardeep Singh Puri. And he was then the Indian ambassador, and he was the president of the Security Council during this debate. So he played an interesting role there. He had to hold it together. So his book is very informative. But the Russians and Chinese will say that they abstained in Resolution 1973, which was the key resolution under Chapter 7. And they said they will never again abstain. That they know they cannot trust, that's what they say, the West, to take a UN resolution and conduct merely R2P. They'll move to, they understand R2P as regime change. And they argue, with some merit, that in Syria, an R2P would be catastrophic. That is, regime change would be catastrophic. And that they therefore see themselves as a shield against chaos. That's their view. In fact, what has ended the possibility of R2P or Chapter 7 for Syria is the Russian intervention. Because remember, the Russians intervene with the government invitation, so there is no violation of sovereignty, because the government is allowed you in. Last year, at a donors meeting in Istanbul, 2 aid workers went up to John Kerry, Secretary John Kerry, and said to him, why don't you do something to take out Assad? Frustration. And he replied, he got angry. It's hard to make John Kerry angry actually. If you ever talk to him, he's quite a very thoughtful, sensible person. He got angry and he said, what do you want me to do? Go to war against Russia? That actually is the US policy at this point. That whatever happens, the United States understands that to bomb Damascus is a very serious attack on on US-Russian relations. So anything short of that is possible, but not that. Now, protection of civilians. See, the Syria case is interesting because certainly 500,000 people are dead. Half the population displaced. The destruction of an entire country. For this book, I interviewed a large number of financiers of the Syrian revolt. Qatari sheikh, very interesting man. But the main person I interviewed was a Syrian businessman. We sat actually right at the Green Line in Beirut in an apartment, and he had a 6 cell phones. It was interesting. His body, and he's telling me that he was from the Homs Hama area and was a major financier of the revolt. And he said within weeks we saw outside funding coming in and financing certain people that we didn't like. And he said within weeks the revolt was gone. And he had written letters to Kofi Annan, as a person, Syrian person, saying, I beg you, tell them to stop funding, we'll take care of this ourselves. I found that to be very interesting. Because it tells you something about the character of what's happening in Syria. It also tells you something about propaganda. So, of course, the Russians, the Iranians, the Syrian government, Hezbollah, etc., are in the middle of a very serious attack on Aleppo. Lots of people are dying. Hospitals are getting hit, etc. But we don't hear anything about rebel shelling of, East Aleppo and West Aleppo are divided. The rebels have been hitting government side heavily, killing children. Recently, a swimmer, Syrian Olympic swimmer, was killed. This doesn't become part of the story. This is truly a civil war. This is not a one-sided carnage. When they say 500,000 dead, it's not 500,000 killed by the government. It's 500,000 killed in a brutally fratricidal war. For which the only end point is a ceasefire and a political conversation. Sadly, and this has nothing to do with anything from what you asked, but sadly, because of this shift in Turkey, coup d'etat happens. The Turkish government says, we are angry with America because your neighbor, Mr. Gulen, is not being handed over, etc. So the Turkish government says, forget, we are going to change our posture vis-a-vis our proxies. Their Turkish help to the rebels in Aleppo was fundamental. When that began to dry up, the Syrian government said, now we can take Aleppo. So the ceasefire is gone for now. They'll take Aleppo, then maybe an opening will come. I think it's important for the government to open a peace process with the various parties as quickly as possible. Because as I argued here, you can never win a complete victory. There are large numbers of Syrians who are disaffected from the government, who are angry with it, who hate the government. You can't win this war. You have to win a peace. And that's not on the horizon right now. Very quickly on your last point, it is a mystery, an honest mystery. There is 9/11. There are a large number of Saudi nationals involved. There was a report made by the Congress, and Senator Graham was one of the important co-chairs of the commission. 28 pages were sealed. When those 28 pages were released, they were not taken as seriously as they should have. And by the way, those pages were written then. There's been lots of more investigations since then. There are serious questions that Senator Bob Graham has raised in recent weeks in interviews, where he's talked about the role of Ambassador Bandar. What was his role? Nobody is saying that the Saudi government conducted the attack in 9/11, but let's have a full discussion of the role. And I think the lack of transparency or discussion about this has led frustration to this bill. Now, it's an important issue of who gets what right to sue whom. People in Pakistan, civilians who've been killed by a drone strike, have a very hard time getting any legal redress. At most, if you've seen Jeremy Scales' film Dirty Wars, at most US officer arrives and kills a goat or a sheep and pays some money. That you see an incident of that where these civilians were killed brutally in their house. They were in a marriage party, etc. It opens the movie. Anyway, this is a serious question of who gets the right to redress. So, because the American financial system is global and because so many countries keep their wealth in American banks, it's easier for American nationals to seek redress against foreign powers. Against Iran, for instance, holding Iranian money. Let's say that a country, let's take a country, Niger. Niger says, we want to sue the United States government. So what are they going to seize in assets? No. They don't have control over the financial system, etc. So this unevenness of lawsuits is something to think about. Now, I'm actually less interested in that and more interested in, let's have an open dialogue about why checks were sent to people in San Diego that were involved in this, etc. So I think the more openness we have in it, see, what is a conspiracy theory? A conspiracy theory is frustration in the public because they don't know what exactly happened. At which note, thanks a lot.